In 1887, Edmund Farrow saved the city of Harwick, Pennsylvania, from losing its entire municipal record. Part D carried 43 boxes of documents from a burning building over the course of one night and filed a careful inventory of everything he had saved. The city commemorated his effort. A street in the civic quarter still bears his name. What the commemoration does not mention, what the street sign does not record, is the ledger I found in the archive's basement storage room, written in Farrow's own hand, that lists 51 boxes removed from the fire. The difference is 8 boxes. B. Do not appear in any official inventory before or after 1887. They were not listed as missing. They were not listed at all. Edmund Farrow had worked as a municipal clerk in Harwick for 11 years before the fire. A personnel file, which survived because it was stored in a separate building, described his position as records keeper and listed his previous employment as copyist for the Harwick Mechanics Institute, an organization that had operated in the city since 1849. The Mechanics Institute was not a school in the modern sense. It was a mutual improvement society affiliated with craft trades, a guild-adjacent organization that maintained a library, offered instruction in technical subjects, and kept detailed records of its members' activities, obligations, and entitlements. Farrow had worked there for 6 years before joining the city's administrative staff. He understood records as instruments of collective life, not bureaucratic product. The records he managed at the municipal building were not purely administrative. Harwick had been incorporated in 1831, and its early documentation reflected the organizational habits of the communities that had founded it. The land registry contained not just property titles, but usage agreements, documents establishing commons rights for specific neighborhoods, water access arrangements predating the city's formal water system, and guild obligation records specifying what trades owed to the city and what the city owed to the trades in return. The poor relief rolls were cross-referenced with guild membership lists, because eligibility for city assistance had historically been tied to contribution records maintained by the trade organizations. These were not purely historical curiosities. In 1887, they remained legally operative, documents that could be and were cited in property disputes and assistance eligibility determinations. The fire started on the evening of November 14th. The cause was recorded. A stove malfunctioned in the building superintendent's office on the 2nd floor. The fire spread quickly to the 3rd floor, where construction permits and council minutes were stored, and then worked its way down through the building over the following 2 days. Farrow arrived within an hour of the alarm, before the fire brigade had the blaze under control, and began removing materials from the ground floor storage rooms where the land registry and poor relief records were kept. The commission's report noted that he worked continuously through the first night, making multiple trips between the building and the street, and that several other city employees assisted during the second day, when the fire was confined to the upper floors. The official inventory Farrow filed on December 3, 1887, 3 weeks after the fire, listed 43 boxes of recovered materials. The inventory was organized by record type, land registry volumes, tax assessment ledgers, construction permit files, council minutes through 1879, poor relief rolls through 1884, It was thorough and carefully prepared. The kind of document produced by someone who understood what he had saved and wanted it properly accounted for. The City Commission accepted it without revision. The commendation was issued on December 18th. The basement ledger was different in character from the official inventory. It was not a formal document. It was a working record. The kind of notation a careful person makes for their own reference, rather than for institutional submission. The entries were dated across 3 days, November 14th through November 16th, corresponding to the nights and early mornings of the fire. 43 of the entries matched the official inventory precisely. Same box numbers, same record types, same dates of coverage. Big. The additional 8 entries were grouped together at the end of the November 14th section. The first night, before any other employees had arrived to assist, they were described in language that differed from the rest of the ledger. Where the official materials were identified by record type. These 8 were identified by what Farrow called their subject matter. The descriptions were brief. Box 44, Prior Claims, Water, Eastern District. Through 1871. Box 45, Guild Obligations, Medical and Relief, Harwick Trades, Bick Kerr, through 1879. Box 46, Commons Usage, River Frontage, Disputed. Bits through 1882. Box 47, Prior Claims, Land, Northern Parcels, Incomplete. But the remaining 4 boxes were described with similar compression. Prior Claims, Disputed. Guild Records, Commons. The language was the language of a lawyer or a trained records keeper who understood exactly what these documents established and exactly why that mattered. Farrow had not accidentally omitted them from the official inventory. He had removed them from the building on the first night before anyone else arrived, and then filed an inventory that did not mention them. The timing of the fire was not incidental to the records it threatened. In the autumn of 1887, Harwick was in the middle of a franchise dispute. The Harwick Water Company, incorporated in 1881, had been operating the city's water system under a provisional agreement that was due for renewal. A competing proposal from the city council would have returned water distribution to municipal control. The water company's legal position depended in part on the argument that its 1881 franchise had superseded all prior arrangements regarding water access in the city. Prior claims, Water Eastern District, WI through 1871. Records in Box 44 would have documented what those prior arrangements had actually been. I found a letter in the archives of the Harwick Historical Society that had not been catalogued with the main collection. 8. Was written by Farrow in January 1888, 2 months after the fire, addressed to a man named Thomas Calloway, identified in the city directory for that year as secretary of the Harwick Mechanics Institute. The letter was brief. Farrow wrote that the materials they had discussed were secure and that he had made arrangements for their continued safekeeping. E. asked Calloway to confirm receipt of the accompanying note, which was not preserved with the letter. He did not specify what the materials were. He signed it with his name and his title, Municipal Records Keeper, City of Harwick, as if the official designation were a kind of reassurance that what he was doing was sanctioned. It was not sanctioned. It was deliberate, careful, and invisible to the institution he served. He accepted the commendation in December without correction. Bayes' name went into the civic record. Bar. The street in the civic quarter that still bears his name was designated in 1923, 36 years after the fire, when the city celebrated the 40th anniversary of the new municipal building. The ceremony program listed his achievement as saving 43 boxes of irreplaceable civic records at personal risk during the fire of 1887. The number was precise. Right. Was also by 8. Wrong. Dr. Sarah Van, a legal historian at the University of Pittsburgh, had spent 14 years researching the privatization of municipal water systems in Pennsylvania during the late 19th century. Her work focused on the legal mechanisms by which cities had transferred control of public infrastructure to private companies, and specifically on the role that documentary gaps, missing records, destroyed archives, and incomplete inventories had played in resolving contested franchise disputes in favor of private operators. I found her research through a footnote in a legal history journal. She had published a study in 2011 on water rights litigation in Western Pennsylvania between 1880 and 1920. In a single paragraph near the end of the paper, she mentioned Harwick. She had found a reference to the hidden boxes in the transcript of a 1903 legal proceeding. B. Harwick Water Company had sued the city council over a proposed modification to the franchise terms, and during the discovery process, the company's attorneys had submitted a motion to compel production of documents described in a municipal memo as records held separately from the main archive. The city's legal counsel had responded that no such records existed in the municipal collection. The judge had accepted that representation and denied the motion. The case had proceeded on the basis of the documentary record as officially constituted, meaning without the prior claims, documentation that would have established what water access arrangements had existed before the company's 1881 franchise. The water company won. The franchise was renewed on terms favorable to the company. The Eastern District water rights remained under private control for the next 40 years. Dr. Van had noted the 1903 motion and the city's response in her research files, but had been unable to locate the separately held records the memo referenced. She did not know about the basement ledger. When I contacted her in 2017 and described what I had found, she asked me to read her the 8-box descriptions from the ledger. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that box 40 prior claims, water, Eastern District, through 1871, would have documented water access agreements that predated the Harwick Water Company's incorporation by a decade. If those agreements had established community or guild rights to water access in the Eastern District, the company's claim to exclusive franchise rights would have been legally contestable. The 1903 case might have been decided differently. The 40 years of private control that followed might not have happened. The 8 boxes had not stayed in Pharaoh's possession indefinitely. The January 1888 letter to Thomas Calloway of the Mechanics Institute suggested they had been transferred to that organization's custody. Mechanics Institute had maintained a building on Crane Street until 1912. When the organization dissolved following the deaths of its founding members and the dispersal of its younger membership into the new, industrial unions that were replacing gilded mutual societies across Pennsylvania. The building was sold. The contents, according to a notice in the Harwich Gazette from April 1912, were to be distributed among member families, donated to the city library, or disposed of at the discretion of the liquidating committee. I contacted the Harwich Public Library to ask whether any records from the Mechanics Institute had been donated in 1912. A librarian searched the accession records and found an entry from October 1912, noting that receipt of 12 boxes of materials from the Mechanics Institute estate. The entry described the contents as bound volumes, pamphlets, membership records, and miscellaneous documents. Books had been placed in the library's storage room and catalogued in 1923 as part of a general inventory. I asked whether the catalogue was available. The librarian sent me a scanned copy. 11 of the 12 boxes were described in detail, their contents listed by type and date range. But the 12th box was described as miscellaneous municipal documents. Origin uncertain, condition poor, its contents were not itemized. Its current location was listed as off-site storage. Off-site storage meant a contracted facility 12 miles outside Harwich, where the library sent materials that were no longer actively used but had not been formally One submitted a research access request in 2018. The library's director responded that materials in off-site storage were available to researchers by appointment, but that retrieval required advance notice of at least 30 days and a completed research justification form. I submitted the form. 37 days later, I received a response stating that the box described as miscellaneous municipal documents, origin uncertain, had been reviewed by library staff and determined to be in too fragile a condition for researcher handling. Response noted that the library was exploring options for conservation treatment, and that access might be possible at a future date. I submitted a follow-up inquiry in 2019. The response restated that the materials were fragile and that conservation planning was ongoing. Dr. Van submitted her own access request in 2020, citing her academic affiliation and offering to conduct any examination under supervised archival conditions using conservation standard handling protocols. Library's response thanked her for her interest and reiterated that the materials required conservation work before access could be granted. No timeline was provided. No conservation assessment was ever shared with either of us. The pattern of what had been lost in the 1887 fire and what those losses had enabled was not limited to the water franchise. Poor relief rolls that Faro's official inventory listed only through 1884 had been used until the fire to determine eligibility for city assistance programs. After the fire, the City Council passed new ordinances establishing assistance eligibility criteria that did not reference the prior roles or the guild membership cross-referencing system those roles had used. The new criteria were simpler, based on residency duration and demonstrated destitution rather than the prior system's recognition of contribution records. Several hundred families who had been receiving assistance under the old system were reassessed under the new criteria in 1888 and 1889. A significant number were found ineligible. The Commission minutes from that period recorded the reassessments as a routine administrative modernization. The prior rolls that would have documented those families' eligibility under the old system were officially among the records lost in the fire. They were actually in Box 40-5. The Harwick fire had not been the only municipal record loss in Pennsylvania during that period. 1883, 4 years before a fire in the records office of Kellerton, a smaller city 60 miles to the northwest. BAC had destroyed land registry documentation covering property along the Kellerton River. Within 18 months of the fire, a contested stretch of river frontage that had been subject to a community access dispute for over a decade was transferred to a private lumber company. The prior documentation of community usage rights, which local residents had cited in the dispute for years, was no longer available to support their legal position. The lumber company's title was confirmed by the county court. Community access was extinguished. The Kellerton fire had not been investigated as arson. Neither had the Harwick fire. Both were recorded as accidental, stove malfunctions, or chimney failures. The standard explanations for building fires in an era when open flame heating was universal and investigation capacity was limited. But the pattern, when mapped across Pennsylvania and neighboring states during the same decades, was difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. In Westbrook, Ohio, in 1891, a fire destroyed the county recorder's office for months before a scheduled court hearing on competing claims to a stretch of canal-adjacent land. The hearing proceeded without the documentation that would have supported the prior claimants. Land was transferred. In Alderton, New York, in 1896, the city clerk's office burned during a franchise dispute over street railway rights. The railway company's application, which had been contested on the basis of prior public usage documentation, was approved after the fire. The documentation was gone. Dr. Margaret Holt, a historian of urban governance at Carnegie Mellon University, had spent 8 years compiling what she called an incident register, a systematic record of municipal building fires in the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest between 1870 and 1920 that had resulted in the destruction of land registry or franchise documentation. She had identified 37 incidents. In 29 of the 37 cases, she had been able to document a significant property transaction or franchise award within 3 years of the fire. In 19 of those 29 cases, the transaction had been contested before the fire and uncontested after it, because the documentation supporting the contesting party's position had been among the records destroyed. She described the pattern in a 2014 paper as consistent with systematic exploitation of fire risk in an era of inadequate record security, carefully stopping short of claiming deliberate arson. But the paper was published in a specialist journal with a circulation of approximately 800 academic subscribers. It was not reviewed in the general press. The legal mechanism that made record destruction so consequential was not complicated. In property and franchise disputes, the burden of proof rested with the party asserting a prior claim. If you argued that your community had established water rights before a company's franchise, you needed documentation. If you argued that a piece of land had been subject to commons usage arrangements that predated a developer's title, you needed documentation. Without documentation, Courts applied the principle that an uncontested title or franchise was presumptively valid. Record destruction did not require anyone to fabricate a legal claim. It simply removed the evidentiary basis for contesting the claims that already existed on paper. Fire did the legal work without requiring anyone to commit perjury or fraud. It required only that the right records burn and that no copies exist elsewhere. Farrow had understood this. The January 1888 letter to Calloway did not explain his reasoning, but the box descriptions in the basement ledger did. Prior claims disputed. Commons Guild records. He had not saved the administrative records of institutional convenience, the tax rolls and construction permits that the city needed to function day to day. Those were in the official 43 boxes. He had saved the records that documented what communities and trade organizations had established before the institutional framework that employed him had existed. Trace the records that could not be reconstructed from other sources, the records whose absence would be most useful to the parties that stood to benefit from the fire. The Harwick Water Company's franchise was renewed in 1903, extended in 1921, and ultimately transferred to a regional utility conglomerate in 1947, the Eastern District water rights. Box 44 would have documented, remained under private control through all of those transactions. Each renewal and transfer was legally clean because each proceeded on the basis of the documentary record as it officially existed, which was to say, without the prior claims, documentation that had been in Farrow's 8 boxes. The 1903 legal motion that had sought those records had been denied on the city's representation that they did not exist in the municipal collection. Bat representation was technically accurate. Beck records were not in the municipal collection. They were in the Mechanics Institute building on Crane Street, where they remained until the organization dissolved in 1912 and the building was sold. What happened to the 8 boxes between 1912 and the present is not fully documented. Library's 12th box, miscellaneous municipal documents, origin uncertain, may contain some or all of them. The fragile condition cited as the reason for denying researcher access may be genuine, the result of a century of uncontrolled storage conditions, or it may be a convenient administrative barrier. I cannot determine which without access. I have not been granted. Dr. Van submitted a 3rd access request in 2022, this time through the Pennsylvania State Archives' formal mediation process for disputed researcher access. The library responded to the State Archives that the materials were undergoing conservation assessment, and that access decisions would be made following the completion of that process. The State Archives accepted this response. No assessment timeline was provided. The City of Harwick still maintains a page on its municipal website dedicated to its civic history. Edmund Farrow is listed in the section on notable historical figures. The entry describes him as the municipal clerk who saved 43 boxes of irreplaceable city records during the fire of 1887 at personal risk and considerable courage. The number is precise. Bush Street, named after him, runs for blocks through the civic quarter, past the current municipal building, past the site where the Mechanics Institute once stood on Crane Street, and past the Eastern District Water Treatment Facility, now operated by a private utility company whose title chain runs directly back to the Harwick Water Company franchise renewed. In 1903, Dr. Van told me in our last conversation that she had spent 3 years trying to determine whether any of the prior claims' documentation had ever been cited in legal proceedings after 1887. She had found one instance. In 1934, a family named Gruber had attempted to contest an eviction from property in the Eastern District on the basis of what their legal petition described as historical usage arrangements. Petition referenced documents held separately from the main municipal archive. The court had found no evidence that such documents existed in any accessible collection and had ruled against the Grubers. The eviction had proceeded. She had not been able to determine how the Grubers had known to reference the separately held documents, or what they had expected those documents to contain. Someone had told them the records existed. The records had not been available to save them. Why does a city celebrate an archivist for saving its records, while the records he saved most carefully remain inaccessible more than a century later? Why did municipal building fires cluster in the exact decades when urban infrastructure was being transferred from public to private control, and when prior claims documentation was most consequential to the outcome of franchise disputes? Why did Farrow separate those 8 boxes on the first night before any other employee arrived, and then accept a commendation for a number he knew was wrong? What did he believe would happen to the records if they appeared in the official inventory? Good. What did he know about who would have access to that inventory and what they would do with the information it contained? The city still has the commendation it issued him in December 1887. The inventory it certified, the number 43 on a document filed in good faith by an institution that did not know it was incomplete. The street that carries his name past the water facility, his hidden records might have kept in public hands. Everything except the 8 boxes he removed from the official count and trusted to an organization that no longer exists, in a building that was sold, in a collection that passed to a library that will not open the last uncatalogued box to anyone who wants to know what Edmund Farrow decided was worth hiding from the people who would have destroyed it.